Hello and welcome to the Blue Amber Saga. Today I wanted to talk more about my own experience of living with a hidden disability and how it affects me, as well as some of the things that I find can be helpful. Now, most people know that I have autism, but unless I actually mention it, then a lot of people wouldn't be able to tell. However, it still has a big impact on how I respond, although I don't show any kind of noticeable signs. The way I think of it is a bit like how bees view everything in ultraviolet light, and to them it all appears to be, in effect, black and white. Now, when looking at a flower, so both people and bees can identify a flower and agree with each other, oh, look, that looks like a flower. And even though they have kind of different viewpoints, however, there are other times where they will actually both respond in a completely different way, or which can actually be really confusing as to how they came up with their own idea of what's going on. Now, I should say, when I'm talking about this, I don't see this as an excuse to not learn from each other's perspective, and in most cases, it can actually work from both sides. Although, something just to be aware of on my side is that there may be never a possibility, or it might even just take years to truly understand what's going on from the other person's perspective. But though saying that, sometimes it can actually be a lot shorter and can actually, yeah, it can be solved quite quickly. Now, I should say, so this video does focus more on some of the more lower points of living with a disability. However, I feel it's important to kind of talk about these anyway. And also, I wanted to kind of confirm and highlight that although there are great hardships at times, and I think there's actually lots of positive aspects to it all, which I will talk about these in kind of in more detail in other videos. And also, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I find helpful and how you guys can help me as well. And so, some of the ways that it affects me. So, one thing that affects me is actually the perception of time, which is kind of a bit of a weird one because I mean, so I can read a clock and I can tell you, oh yeah, it's 1 o'clock now, and tell you what a clock face looks like. But the one of the bits that I tend to struggle with can actually be like physical distances, so like crossing a road and knowing when a car's coming along and whether you can make it in time. But also the kind of sensation of how like a week feels like it, or no, sorry, a day feels like a week, and vice versa, of which time seems to go really slowly on my side of things. Um, Another bit is kind of sensory issues. So although I don't have sensory meltdowns a lot these days, then actually I still feel the world in that way. So because of my sensitivity hearing or super sensitive hearing, then I'm unable to actually filter sound. So all that still has an effect on me, although you may not necessarily be able to see it. But though something to be aware is that, especially when I'm really highly stressed, then those kind of sensitive or those sensory experiences can actually occur. And that's normally a really big red flag for me when those happen. Another thing is eye contact. So I can't actually look anyone in the eye, which is quite weird. And I can't tell you what color your eyes are unless it's a really rare case. Um, and in effect, it's like looking into the sun. And so it causes this discomfort, which I don't really know why that is, though. It's a bit bizarre. Another thing for me is I tend to see things in black and white in terms of it's either all or nothing. And that's partly because of, I think, kind of like positive feedback loops. And so basically, I don't ever have this kind of grey area. And that happens with emotions, especially. And so I might not feel anything, but it will suddenly build up really quickly. And then I could be at the opposite ends of a spectrum, for instance. And so to me, it's kind of like saying I have a toolkit of which I've got like a really small hammer, and then I've got an atomic bomb, and that's basically my toolkit. Of which, especially when talking about certain situations or dealing with situations, then sometimes the response can seem quite extreme for actually what it is, and that's partly because of that. Those social situations tend to be my biggest kind of like Achilles heel, and that's partly because of mind blindness, which I'll talk about in other videos. And it's basically the kind of interpreting of emotion kind of through sympathy. And so the way I look at it is it's kind of like a plane control tower where the information's coming in of where all the planes are, but though the information doesn't necessarily come in that accurately at times. And so sometimes you might have planes missing, or the information displayed is completely different of like how fast they are. And also like the warning systems to say, oh yeah, something's about to happen. That for me it tends to happen a lot later on. So if I know a problem's about to occur, normally when I say that and say, okay, let's talk about it or respond to something in such a way, then it normally means, okay, it's probably about to happen imminently, and yeah, it needs to be sorted out quicker rather than later. Another side to me is I call it kind of glass barriers, of which it's basically like an unconscious mental block in socializing. And I can find this really hard because I get this sense of basically losing my own voice, and that can lead to anxiety. And I don't really know why it happens, but it's kind of I get like this amnesia as well alongside it. So sometimes you'll find when I'm talking that I'll literally just cut off, and it's trying to kind of um, as I say this, it happens right now, and basically yeah, reconnect all the kind of puzzle pieces together again to continue as normal. And yeah, so this actually becomes really problematic, particularly in group settings, because the kind of flow of conversation tends to be quite fast, and yeah, it's even harder to kind of yeah deal with those situations. Another thing is meltdowns. So I don't have physical ones these days where I go and punch someone and trying to hide under a table like I used to do when I was little. But though I do still have them occur, but they just happen inside my head, which if you think of all the kind of frustration and the anxiety from that, then yeah, I just don't physically display it anymore. Of which is quite interesting because normally when these happen, then it drives me to wanting to solve an issue or bring back control, which normally results in some kind of creative solution, um, which is quite cool, but also something just to bear in mind. Another thing is so unfamiliar situations I can find really weird, and especially in terms of like with timing. So that's why I always turn up really early to things. But also um, areas that I can struggle with that is anything which is also food related in terms of going out for a meal and such, where because I'm a super taster, then it can be a lot harder to join in with those, and so that can create anxiety. And then the final thing, which there isn't really a name which I could think to describe this best, but I've basically described it as the bad guy complex, which is basically that if there's a problem in a situation or I sense there to be an awkwardness or such, then basically the kind of the cause of it and the kind of blame aspect, I tend to kind of psychologically assign it to me because of that's just how things have tended to be the case, like just growing up. And so because of that, even if something which seems like hardly a problem at all, but to me it could seem like a big deal, then actually, yeah, I put quite a lot of pressure on myself because of that. And it's basically knowing and being able to say, well, actually, it isn't, or that isn't the case. And basically trying to convince yourself, yeah, that's, yeah, you know what I mean. Um, so some of the ways that can be helpful for me with these things. So as I said, kind of on my Facebook page, so a lot of the time I kind of tend to act like a detective, kind of trying to work out what is going on, especially on things that have occurred previously, and to try and overcome some of these kind of weaknesses and these kind of weak points. And from that, basically, you guys are kind of part of the solution to actually helping to potentially achieve breakthroughs in this. So you're all um, are able to help out in this, which is really cool. And so some of the things that can be helpful for this is actually just talking about it, of which going back to the mind blindness aspect of things, then a lot of the time when issues occur, then actually I'm completely oblivious and just unaware of what was going on. And so if I do something to upset you, then it's not intentional. It's because I've generally didn't know that was going on, and so I actually really apologise for that. Um, Being patient and just bearing with me with this. As I say, I don't show signs that often, and I'm not, as I say, I'm not trying to do it on purpose. And when things do go wrong, then just bear with me with that. Um, Meltdowns. So if you think of it, so meltdowns, the reason they occur is actually part of a balancing process to resolve an issue where I feel like there's a lack of control. And that could even be whether it's actually is genuinely an issue and it being real, or it could be just something I've just imagined. And so I'm putting all this, basically, I'm responding to, in effect, nothing. And so basically, if there's an issue like that happens, then actually um, it needs to be solved relatively quickly, and also kind of assurance given in those kind of situations. And if it's able to be sorted out like that, then actually it can melt away really fast. So something to bear in mind. Also, just having structure in place can be really helpful, especially with food stuff where um, we know what meals are going on, and opportunities to kind of talk about food preferences and such. And then the final thing I would say was having the opportunity to ask questions and to discuss it further can be really helpful because it helps bring clarity to what is going on. And so I hope these are helpful. And in future videos, I will dive into some of these topics a bit more. And as I say, so this list isn't extensive, so there are other things, but I thought this is a great kind of a summary of some of the stuff I do um, tend to have issues with. And so so feel free to comment or email about anything that's been discussed. Or if you want to know more about particular bits, then I'm really open to that as well. And so you have been watching the Blue Amber Saga.